My name is Wendy Roberts, and I am 24 years old. 4 weeks ago, my parents forged my signature on a probate waiver and emptied my grandmother Lucille's estate. They took $800,000, meant to be split evenly, and divided every last cent between themselves and my younger sister Paige. They assumed because I work 60-hour weeks at an emergency veterinary clinic, I was too exhausted to notice the paperwork. They thought I was too soft to fight back. They were wrong. They did not know my grandmother had left one final document hidden away just for me. A document worth $6.2 million. A document that was about to strip away everything they thought they had stolen. Before I tell you what was in that hidden envelope and what happened at Paige's lavish engagement party, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the Sophia Vengeance channel, drop a comment below, and let me know how old you are and where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to the afternoon I discovered their betrayal. The winter wind was whipping off Lake Mendota the afternoon I checked my mail. I stood in the narrow hallway of my apartment building, my hands still smelling faintly of the antibacterial soap from the clinic. Among the junk mail and utility bills was a thick envelope stamped by the Dane County Probate Court. It had been forwarded to my address by mistake. I unlocked my door and tossed my keys onto the laminate counter. My boots left wet tracks on the floor as I tore the envelope open. Inside lay a standard legal waiver. The text stated the undersigned surrendered all rights and claims to the liquid estate of Lucille Roberts. At the bottom of the page sat my signature. The loop of the W and the sharp cross of the T looked perfect. My father Paul had practiced it well. The paper rattled in my shaking hands. A cold sweat broke across the back of my neck. My own family had bypassed the courts, faked my consent, and stolen the only safety net my grandmother had left me. I pictured the family dinner we had just 2 nights ago. My mother Karen sat across the table swirling red wine in her glass. She looked at my faded scrubs and let out a long sigh. "Wendy, you really need to find a career with upward mobility. Look at your sister. Paige is making such smart financial moves." Paige had smiled and adjusted a diamond tennis bracelet that definitely had not been there the week before. They were sitting there wearing my grandmother's money and lecturing me about hard work. My chest tightened. I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over my father's contact name. I wanted to call him and demand the truth. I wanted to hear his voice crack when I confronted him with the felony he had just committed. But then I heard my grandmother's voice. Lucille was a Wisconsin dairy farmer carved from granite. She used to stand by the pasture gate in the dead of winter, wrapping her calloused hands over mine. "Watch the ice before you step, Wendy." I slowly lowered the phone. Confrontation would give them the chance to spin a lie or hire defense attorneys with my own money. In the veterinary clinic, I see what happens when a parasite feeds too fast. It drains the host until there is nothing left. My parents had latched onto the bait. I laid the forged document flat on the kitchen table, pulled out my phone, and took a high-resolution photograph. I folded the paper, slipped it back into the envelope, and hid it beneath the floorboards under my bed. I did not scream. I did not cry. I chose silence. I was going to let them spend every single dollar until the trap snapped shut. 2 weeks after I hid the forged probate waiver beneath the floorboards of my apartment, Paige drove up to our parents' house in a pristine, white, luxury sport utility vehicle. The heavy tires crunched over the gravel driveway, rolling to a stop near the front porch. The engine purred with a low, refined hum of European engineering that did not belong in our quiet, working-class Wisconsin neighborhood. Paige stepped out, draped in a tailored camel wool coat. The crisp autumn air was instantly overwhelmed by her scent. It was a suffocating, heavy floral designer perfume. It smelled expensive, but synthetic, entirely lacking the grounding earthiness of the wildflowers Grandmother Lucille used to grow near her porch. I stood on the front steps in my faded navy scrubs, shivering as a biting gust of wind swept off the lake. My boots were 3 years old, the left heel worn down from pacing the hard concrete floors of the veterinary clinic for 10 hours a day. Paige clicked the lock on her key fob. The vehicle chirped. She smiled at me, a tight, practiced expression that did not reach her eyes, like the new ride. Paige asked, running a manicured hand along the side mirror. "Dad helped me invest some of my savings. You should really talk to him about a portfolio, Wendy. Keeping all your cash in a basic checking account is just bad financial hygiene." Savings. My 22-year-old sister, who worked 20 hours a week as a receptionist at a tanning salon, supposedly had enough savings to drop $80,000 on a luxury vehicle. The lie was so thin it was transparent, yet she delivered it with absolute conviction. The real turning point happened a few days later. A brutal cold front had moved through the state, bringing freezing rain that coated the bare oak trees in a layer of clear ice. I drove to my parents' house on my lunch break to drop off a spare key my mother had requested. They were not home. As I walked up the driveway, the wind whipped the freezing rain against my face. Next to the garage, the large municipal trash bin was overflowing. The heavy plastic lid was propped open by a stack of stiff, glossy cardboard. I stepped closer, my wet boots slipping slightly on the slick pavement. Wedged between mundane garbage bags and empty wine bottles were 4 immaculate designer shopping bags. They featured thick rope handles and embossed gold lettering. These were the kind of bags that held items requiring a dedicated salesperson and a glass of complimentary champagne. I reached out, my fingers numb from the cold, and pulled one of the receipts stuck to the bottom of a velvet shoebox. $4,200. I stood there in the freezing rain. The water seeped through the thin fabric of my scrubs, chilling my skin to the bone. I calculated the numbers in my head while staring at the wet receipt. That single pair of discarded shoes could pay my rent for 2 full months. It could cover my groceries for half a year. They were treating my grandmother's life savings like a limitless lottery payout. They were throwing the physical evidence of their theft right into the trash, leaving it out in the rain because it meant nothing to them. A familiar heat rose in my chest. I felt a sharp urge to kick the trash bin over to shatter the glass of the front window, to wait on the porch until they returned, so I could demand they look me in the eye and admit what they had done. But the heat faded into a cold, crystalline focus. If I confronted them now, Paul would put up an impenetrable defensive wall. Karen would cry, manipulate the narrative, and claim I was a jealous, ungrateful daughter trying to ruin their happiness. They would quickly hide the rest of the money in offshore accounts or untouchable trusts. I realized the greatest weapon I possessed was their own unchecked arrogance. I did not need to fight them for the $800,000. I needed to help them spend it. I needed to make them so comfortable, so blind with greed that they would drain the Bate estate to zero. This was the true beginning of the inheritance game. The following Sunday evening, I sat across from my mother at the dining room table. The dinner spread was excessive. Artisan cheeses, imported cured meats, and a centerpiece of exotic orchids that belonged in a bridal magazine. Karen picked at a piece of sharp cheddar. She wore a new silk blouse that caught the light of the chandelier, her neck adorned with a delicate diamond pendant. Wendy. Dear, Karen began, her tone dripping with manufactured concern. Your father and I worry about your trajectory. You work such grueling hours cleaning up after sick animals. It is a noble hobby, but it is not a career. You have to start thinking about your future. Look at Paige. Paige swirled her sparkling water, leaning back in her chair. I am actually putting a down payment on a condo downtown this week. It has floor-to-ceiling windows and a 24-hour concierge. You just have to know how to leverage your assets, Wendy. I kept my expression carefully blank. I forced a look of mild awe onto my face, widening my eyes just enough to feign genuine admiration. I folded my hands in my lap under the table, hiding the fact that my knuckles were white from gripping my own fingers. You are right, I said softly, staring down at my water glass. I just do not understand finances the way you all do. I am exhausted all the time. It is hard to think about investments when I barely understand my own savings account. How did you do it, Paige? How did you afford a down payment so fast? Paul puffed his chest out, leaning back in his mahogany chair. He was a man who had spent his life as a mid-level regional manager, always dreaming of being a big-shot real estate tycoon, but never having the capital. Now, using my forged signature, he was finally playing the part. He adjusted the cuffs of a crisp new dress shirt. It takes a sharp eye, Wendy Paul said, using a low, authoritative voice. I guided your sister into some aggressive growth funds. Timing the market is an art form. It requires capital, yes, but mostly it requires instinct. Something you could learn if you stopped burying yourself in that clinic. I wish I had your instinct, Dad, I replied, keeping my voice steady and deferential. You always seem to know exactly when to make a move. Paige is lucky to have you managing things. If I had money, I would trust you with every cent. The flattery worked like a charm. Paul beamed his ego inflating to fill the dining room. Karen smiled, satisfied that she had successfully asserted her dominance over my life choices. They looked at each other, sharing a secret, silent victory. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully broken my spirit and convinced me of their inherent superiority. They did not realize that by asking for their advice, I was giving them permission to be reckless. I was validating their delusion that they were financial geniuses rather than common thieves who had forged a signature on a county probate form. Over the next 3 weeks, the spending accelerated to a dizzying pace. Paige booked a first-class trip to the Bahamas with her fiancé Derek. Paul traded in his reliable sedan for a luxury sports car with leather seats that smelled like a showroom floor. Karen hired a contractor to rip out the perfectly functional kitchen counters and replace them with imported Italian marble. Every time Paige swiped her platinum credit card, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Every time Paul signed a check for a new extravagant purchase, he was pulling the rope tighter around his own neck. They were converting a pile of stolen cash into highly visible, untraceable liabilities. The Bate estate was shrinking day by day. Keeping up the facade of the naive, struggling daughter took a heavy toll. I watched them parade around town accepting praise from neighbors for their sudden prosperity. I smiled through gritted teeth while they treated me like a charity case, handing me leftover food in plastic containers as if they were doing me a grand favor. I knew the $800,000 would not last forever at this burn rate. And when the money ran out, they would come looking for more. They would look toward the one asset they had not yet liquidated, the 500-acre dairy farm. The farm had been sitting vacant since Lucille passed. Paul had avoided it, complaining about the smell of the soil and the drafty windows of the old farmhouse. He viewed the land as a burden rather than a legacy. But yesterday afternoon, Paige called me with a sharp, demanding tone. She wanted me to drive out to the property this weekend and clean out the deep walk-in pantry. She said they were preparing for an estate sale and wanted the place looking presentable for potential buyers. She expected me to do the heavy lifting for free, just as she always did. She had no idea that by sending me to that empty farmhouse alone, she was handing me the key to a door they did not even know existed. The tires of my beat-up sedan crunched over the frozen gravel of County Road 9. Frost clung to the skeletal branches of the oak trees lining the perimeter of Grandmother Lucille's 500-acre dairy property. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, vibrating against the cheap plastic. Paige's name illuminated the cracked screen. I let it go to voicemail, knowing exactly what she wanted. She had called 3 times since sunrise to ensure I was en route to perform the manual labor she deemed beneath her. When the audio message popped up, I played it over the car speakers. "Wendy, make sure you scrub the walk-in pantry from top to bottom. Dad wants the farmhouse looking pristine for the estate sale appraisers next week. Do not leave any dust. I need this sale finalized so I can book the floral arrangements for the reception." I parked near the rusted tractor sitting idle beside the main barn. Stepping out into the biting cold, I zipped my jacket up to my chin. The wind sweeping across the flat Wisconsin plains carried an edge of ice stinging my cheeks. I pulled a set of brass keys from my pocket and unlocked the heavy oak front door of the farmhouse. The moment I stepped across the threshold, a wave of profound comfort washed over me. The air inside held the distinct grounding scent of aged cheddar-dried sweetgrass and raw white pine. It was the smell of decades of honest labor, a sharp and welcome contrast to the cloying synthetic jasmine perfume Paige wore to cover up her lack of substance. This house breathed. It held memories in the scuffed floorboards and the faded floral wallpaper. I walked into the kitchen and set my bag on the butcher block counter. Through the frost-rimmed window over the sink, I caught movement out in the south pasture. My father was marching through the knee-high dead winter grass. He wore a pristine wool overcoat and shiny leather dress shoes that had never seen a day of actual farm work. He held a cell phone tight against his ear, his free hand chopping through the air as he paced. Even through the double-paned glass, I could read his posture. He was calculating. He stopped, pointed toward the old silo, and swept his arm across the horizon. He was carving up the land in his mind, envisioning concrete driveways, cul-de-sacs, and uniform vinyl siding. He saw zero value in the soil itself. He only saw a blank canvas for subdivision and quick cash. Looking at him standing there, the present melted away. A memory surfaced vivid and warm. I was 12 years old, kneeling in that exact same patch of earth. Grandmother Lucille knelt beside me, her hands caked in rich dark loam. She wore faded denim and an oversized flannel shirt. She held a small plastic tube filled with distilled water and a pinch of earth. She carefully added a few drops of reagent from a testing kit, shaking the tube until the water turned a vibrant shade of green. "Look closely, Wendy," she had said, pointing a calloused finger at the vial. "The pH level tells you the truth about the ground. You cannot fake good soil. You can dress it up with chemical fertilizer for a season, but the earth always reveals its true character eventually. If you do not nurture the foundation, everything you plant will wither." Lucille understood the long game. She knew that cheap fixes yielded hollow results. Paul was out there planning to pave over a century of careful cultivation because he wanted a quick payout. I turned away from the window, my jaw tight, and walked down the narrow hall toward the walk-in pantry. Paige wanted it scrubbed, so I grabbed a bucket of warm water and a stiff, bristled brush. The pantry was a cavernous space, lined with sturdy wooden shelves that once held hundreds of mason jars filled with preserved peaches, pickled beans, and venison jerky. Now it sat mostly empty, gathering cobwebs and shadows. I started at the top, wiping away the dust of neglect. As I reached the bottom shelf, I dropped to my knees to scrub the baseboards. My brush caught the edge of a floorboard in the far back corner. The wood shifted, emitting a strange hollow thud that echoed in the tight space. I set the brush aside and ran my fingertips along the grain. The board was loose. I wedged my fingernails into the narrow gap and pried the plank upward. It gave way with a soft creak, revealing a shallow, dark cavity tucked between the floor joists. Resting inside the dusty recess was a rectangular metal object. I pulled it out into the dim light. It was a vintage Green Bay Packers collector's tin. Its edges rusted, and its painted surface faded from decades of hidden storage. My heart hammered against my ribs. Lucille had kept this tin on her bedside table when I was a child, but it had vanished years before her death. I pried the tight lid off the metal, groaning in protest. Inside lay a heavy envelope made of thick, cream-colored parchment. Next to it rested a broken chunk of dark red sealing wax, the kind Lucille used to seal holiday cards. I opened the envelope. A single sheet of lined notebook paper slid into my palm, covered in Lucille's unmistakable, sharp, cursive handwriting. "My dearest Wendy," the letter began. "If you are reading this, my earthly days have ended, and Paul has already shown you exactly who he is. I always knew my son possessed a weak spine and a wandering eye for easy money. He and Karen will scramble for the cash accounts. They will forge, lie, and steal whatever is not nailed down to fund their empty lives. I left the liquid funds vulnerable on purpose. It is a trap meant for thieves." I stopped reading, my breath catching in the quiet room. Lucille had orchestrated the entire scenario. She had anticipated their exact betrayal. I looked back down at the page. The true wealth of this family is the land, the operation, and the patents I secured over 40 years. But I could not leave it to someone who only sees dollar signs. I had to leave it to the one person who understands the soil. To access my true legacy, you must go to the office of attorney Kenneth Bradley in Milwaukee. He holds the real trust. But Kenneth will not speak to you unless you pass my final test. He requires a password to open the file. You must provide him with the official eartag registration number of Bessie. Bessie. A faint smile broke across my face. Bessie was a cankerous, enormous Holstein cow who had won the blue ribbon at the Wisconsin State Fair 3 years in a row. She was Lucille's pride and joy, but she was notoriously difficult to handle. Paul was terrified of her. Paige refused to walk within 50 feet of the barn because of the manure. I was the only one who had helped Lucille treat Bessie's hoof infections, spending hours in the stall, applying poultices and changing bandages. This was a test designed to filter out the parasites. Paul could never answer this question. He did not even know the animal's name. I carefully folded the letter and slipped it into my scrub pocket. I reached into the tin and picked up the piece of hardened red sealing wax. I rolled the smooth, cold surface between my thumb and forefinger. It felt solid, heavy, with unspoken promise. I slipped the wax into my other pocket to serve as my physical anchor. Whenever the deception required to play this game felt too heavy, I would touch the wax and remember my purpose. I needed that tag number. I left the pantry and hurried down the hall to Lucille's old study. The room was frozen in time, smelling of old paper and dust motes dancing in the pale winter light filtering through the blinds. I bypassed the empty file cabinets, knowing Paul had already ransacked them looking for bank statements. He ignored the agricultural records because he considered them useless clutter. I crouched beside the heavy oak bookshelf and pulled out a thick leather-bound veterinary ledger. The spine cracked as I opened it on the desk. I flipped through the pages, tracing my finger down columns of handwritten notes, tracking breeding cycles, vaccinations, and milk yields. I stopped on a page dated 7 years ago. There it was, Bessie. Next to her name was the 15-digit federal ear tag registration number. I pulled a pen from the desk drawer and wrote the sequence on the inside of my forearm, the blue ink sinking into my skin. Just as I capped the pen, the heavy front door of the farmhouse slammed open, rattling the picture frames in the hallway. Heavy footsteps stomped across the hardwood. Wendy Paul barked, his voice echoing through the empty house. His tone was sharp, impatient, and brimming with unearned authority. "Are you in here?" I quickly shoved the ledger back onto the bottom shelf and stood up, smoothing the front of my scrubs. I pressed my hand against my pocket, feeling the hard lump of the sealing wax. "I am in the study, Dad," I called back, keeping my voice mild and submissive. Paul appeared in the doorway, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold wind. He rubbed his manicured hands together, looking around the room with blatant disgust. "Hurry up and finish whatever you are doing," he commanded. "I just got off the phone with a major commercial developer. He is sending a survey team out here on Monday. We are fast-tracking the sale of this entire dump. I want this place cleared out by Sunday night." He was moving faster than I anticipated. He was already trying to liquidate the real estate without possessing the actual title. He assumed the forged probate waiver gave him unhindered ownership of the earth beneath his feet. "That sounds amazing, Dad," I said, forcing a bright, naive smile. "You really do move fast." Paul puffed his chest out, a self-satisfied smirk settling on his lips. "That is how real business is done, Wendy. You do not wait around for permission. You take what is yours." He turned and walked back down the hall, leaving me alone in the study. My smile vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp determination. He was right about one thing. It was time to stop waiting. I had the letter. I had the wax. I had the password written on my skin. I was ready to drive to Milwaukee. I was ready to unlock the truth and introduce my father to the fatal consequences of taking what did not belong to him. I merged onto Interstate 94, heading east toward Milwaukee. The heater in my sedan struggled against the plunging temperature, blowing lukewarm air over my frozen knuckles. The gray Wisconsin sky stretched wide and unforgiving above the highway. Snow flurries danced across the windshield, brief and erratic. My mind raced faster than the tires humming against the asphalt. The 15-digit number written in blue ink on my forearm felt like a brand burning through my skin. The corporate high-rise in downtown Milwaukee towered over the city streets like a monument to cold efficiency. I parked in a subterranean garage where the air smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. My boots echoed against the polished marble floor of the lobby as I walked toward the elevator bank. Pressing the button for the 42nd floor, my stomach tightened. I was a veterinary technician accustomed to the chaotic, earthy reality of animal clinics. I did not belong in this atmosphere of high finance and tailored suits. But Lucille had sent me here, and she never made a mistake. The reception area of Bradley and Associates was clinical and precise. No warm artwork decorated the stark white walls. The air conditioning hummed with a low, constant vibration. A receptionist with a headset directed me down a long, soundproof corridor to a corner office. Kenneth Bradley stood near a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the frozen surface of Lake Michigan. He was a man in his late 60s, possessing a posture as rigid as a steel beam. His charcoal suit hung perfectly over his lean frame. He turned away from the glass. His eyes, the color of chipped flint, assessed me in a fraction of a second. He did not offer a handshake or a hollow platitude about my grandmother's passing. He merely gestured toward a high-backed leather chair facing his sprawling mahogany desk. "Please sit, Miss Roberts," he instructed, his voice a low baritone that commanded immediate attention. "I have been expecting you." But before we discuss anything regarding Lucille's estate, we have a security protocol to clear." I sat down. The leather was stiff and cold beneath my fingertips. I reached into my scrub pocket, my fingers finding the hardened chunk of red sealing wax. The smooth, uneven surface grounded me. "I have the verification," I replied, maintaining eye contact. Bradley pulled a brass pen from his breast pocket and clicked it once. The sharp sound pierced the silent room. "What is the federal ear tag registration number for the animal in question?" I did not need to roll up my sleeve. The sequence was permanently etched into my memory during the drive. 840031256987742. I recited, keeping my tone flat and certain. Bradley paused. A faint, almost imperceptible nod of approval shifted his rigid features. He set the pen down, turned to a heavy steel safe built into the wall behind him, and dialed a combination. The heavy metal door clicked open. He reached inside and withdrew a thick leather-bound binder, setting it squarely between us on the polished wood. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary strategist," Bradley began, resting his hands on the binder. "She engaged my services 5 years ago to structure her holdings. She knew her son possessed a severe moral deficit. She predicted Paul would attempt a cash grab the moment her pulse stopped. My chest tightened at the sound of my father's name. They forged my signature to take the $800,000 I stated, the reality still tasting bitter on my tongue." Bradley leaned forward, interlacing his fingers. "That $800,000 was a decoy. It was a bait estate left intentionally vulnerable in basic liquid accounts. Lucille wanted to see if they would steal the loose change on the table. By taking it, they triggered a sequence of events they cannot reverse." He opened the binder and turned to the first tab. He slid a summary document toward me. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, catching key phrases and soaring numbers. "The true legacy of Lucille Roberts is not sitting in a local checking account." Bradley continued, his voice taking on a clinical edge. 5 years ago, she transferred the entire commercial dairy operation, the 500 acres of prime agricultural land, and 3 highly lucrative patents for automated milking technology into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I stared at the total valuation printed at the bottom of the page, $6.2 million. The breath left my lungs. I read the number again, ensuring the decimal point was truly where I thought it was. $6,200,000. The worn boots on my feet, the struggling savings account, the unpaid heating bills at my apartment, everything I had worried about yesterday vanished into the pristine white paper sitting before me. "You are the sole beneficiary, Wendy. The trust is impenetrable. No court in this state can touch it, and your father holds 0 legal standing to contest the transfer." I pressed my thumb into the red wax in my pocket until my nail dug into the hardened edge. Why did she not just leave everything to me directly? Why create the bait estate at all? Bradley flipped to another section of the binder, revealing a page highlighted with a yellow marker. "Because Lucille wanted to ensure Paul could never legally harass you for the main asset, she engineered a lethal fraud clause into the fabric of this trust." He pointed his brass pen at the highlighted paragraph. "The clause stipulates that if any immediate family member commits an unlawful act attempting to defraud a designated heir of any portion of the estate, they forfeit all future rights to arbitration contest or claim against the overarching trust." The room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I looked up from the paper, meeting Bradley's flinty gaze. "By forging your signature on the probate waiver for the bait cash, Paul and Karen disqualified themselves from ever touching the $6.2 million. Bradley explained, his tone laced with cold finality. "But the genius of Lucille's trap goes much deeper. In their rush to secure the decoy funds, they utilized electronic banking transfers and filed falsified documents across county lines. They have committed federal wire fraud and state probate fraud." The dynamic within me shifted, snapping into a new, terrifyingly clear alignment. I arrived at this corporate tower as a betrayed daughter seeking answers. I sat in this chair now as a predator holding the leash. My parents thought they had outsmarted a naive veterinary technician. Instead, they had eagerly signed their own criminal indictments. "Do they know about this trust?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They know nothing," Bradley replied, closing the binder with a definitive thud. They believe they have outmaneuvered everyone. They assume the land is theirs to sell, unaware that the title has been shielded by a corporate entity for half a decade. Your grandmother's instructions to me were explicitly clear. You are to take control of the estate, but we must not reveal our hand prematurely. I pulled my hand out of my pocket and placed the chunk of red sealing wax on the edge of his mahogany desk. What is our next move? Bradley looked at the wax, then back to me. Let them think they are kings until they have no castle left. Let them spend the stolen bait. Let them make promises they cannot keep. When a man believes he is invincible, he takes foolish risks. Your father will inevitably attempt to leverage the farm. We will wait for him to step too far out on the ice, and then we will let the frozen surface crack. I stood up from the leather chair. The heavy weight of the binder in my hands felt like a weapon forged from my grandmother's foresight and honed by my own silent endurance. I thanked Bradley and walked out of the office, tracing my steps back down the soundproof corridor, into the elevator, and down to the subterranean concrete garage. Sitting behind the wheel of my freezing sedan, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life. I gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the gray concrete wall. My parents were currently burning through the $800,000 at a staggering rate, financing luxury vehicles, downtown real estate, and extravagant vacations. They were running a race toward a finish line that did not exist. A chilling thought crossed my mind as I shifted the car into drive. Paul was already making calls to commercial developers promising to sell land he did not actually own. He was desperate to convert the farm into concrete and cash. The stolen decoy funds were draining rapidly, and his lavish new lifestyle required constant fuel. By the time the Wisconsin winter yielded to a muddy, bitter spring, the $800,000 decoy fund was evaporating. I watched the drain happen in real time, tracking their social media feeds during my short breaks at the veterinary clinic. Karen posted endless photographs from luxury resorts. One week, she was sipping expensive champagne on a balcony in Aspen, draped in designer ski apparel she would never actually use on a slope. The next week, she showcased a sprawling beachfront villa in St. Bart's. Paige treated the upcoming wedding like a royal coronation. She hired a celebrity floral designer to import rare orchids, securing a catering menu that featured Wagyu beef and white truffles. Wealth, when acquired through honest labor, tends to be quiet. Stolen cash, however, burns a hole in the pockets of thieves. They were converting liquid assets into fleeting experiences and depreciating luxury goods. But maintaining a rich facade requires constant fuel. The sports cars demanded premium insurance. The designer wardrobes required specialized dry cleaning. The lavish trips racked up incidental charges. Paul was discovering that projecting a high society image carried a steep recurring price tag. The strain began to show. During a brief phone call early Tuesday morning, I heard the sharp, frantic edge in my father's voice. He complained about the soaring property taxes on the new vehicles and muttered about hidden fees from his broker. The well was running dangerously low, and panic was quietly setting in. I knew it was time to apply the pressure. I needed him to empty the very last drop of the decoy funds. I invited Paul to lunch at a faded diner off the interstate, a place favored by long-haul truckers and shift workers. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, fried onions, and cheap bleach. The vinyl booths were cracked, mended with strips of silver duct tape. I chose this location specifically to maximize his discomfort. I wanted his tailored suit and expensive watch to feel glaringly out of place, heightening his desperate need to feel superior. He walked through the glass double doors wearing a crisp charcoal blazer and Italian leather loafers that clicked sharply against the scuffed linoleum. He looked around the dining room with undisguised contempt before sliding into the booth across from me. He wiped the laminated table with a paper napkin, his mouth pulled into a tight frown. "Thank you for meeting me, Dad," I said, wrapping my hands around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee. "I know your schedule is incredibly demanding these days." Paul straightened his posture, adjusting his silk tie. "It is a sacrifice, Wendy. Managing a complex portfolio takes constant vigilance. The market waits for no one. You have to stay ahead of the curve." I looked down at my faded scrub top. A faint stain from a canine dental procedure lingered near the collar. I slumped my shoulders, projecting total defeat. I let out a long, ragged sigh, playing the role of the desperate, struggling daughter to perfection. "I just do not know how you do it," I murmured, keeping my gaze fixed on the table. "My transmission started slipping yesterday. The mechanic quoted me $1,200. I have been working 60 hours a week at the clinic picking up every overnight shift, and I still cannot get ahead. I feel like I am drowning in basic expenses." The transformation in his demeanor was instantaneous. The underlying anxiety in his eyes vanished, replaced by a radiant, intoxicating arrogance. My feigned weakness acted as a potent drug inflating his fragile ego. He thrived on the contrast between his fabricated success and my apparent failure. "You lack vision," Wendy Paul lectured, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table. "You trade hours for pennies because you do not understand leverage. Wealth is not about hoarding paychecks. It is about deploying capital to acquire appreciating assets. You have to project success to attract success. Look at the moves I have made for the family. We are operating on an entirely different level now." He was reciting hollow phrases he likely heard on a late-night investment podcast, dressing them up as his own profound wisdom. I nodded slowly, widening my eyes to reflect deep admiration. "You are right," I agreed, my voice thick with fake reverence. "You always know exactly what to do. Paige is so incredibly lucky to have you guiding her. She mentioned that luxury condo downtown, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows. She said the seller requires a massive earnest money deposit to secure the penthouse unit. I suppose a smart investor like you knows real estate is the safest place to park capital." I watched the hook sink deep into his pride. I had presented him with a challenge wrapped in flattery. He could not admit to me the daughter he viewed as a financial failure, that the well was running dry. He had to maintain the illusion of the invincible tycoon. Paul waved his hand dismissively, and though a bead of sweat materialized near his hairline, "The deposit is substantial, yes, but hesitation kills opportunity. I am finalizing the transfer this afternoon. I am liquidating my old retirement accounts from the regional manager position. Those funds are stagnant anyway. I will combine them with the remaining estate cash and buy the unit outright. It secures Paige's status in Derek's social circle, and it adds a premium asset to our column." I took a slow sip of my coffee to hide the cold, sharp smile threatening to break across my face. He was actually doing it. Blinded by pride, he was choosing to drain the very last of the stolen $800,000. Worse, he was voluntarily liquidating his own legitimate retirement savings to fund the delusion. He was pushing all his chips into the center of the table on a rigged game. "That is brilliant, Dad," I said, setting my mug down. "You are building an empire. I only wish I had your courage." Paul puffed his chest out, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "It takes nerve, Wendy. Something you either have or you do not." The dramatic irony sitting between us in that greasy diner booth was suffocating. He sat there in his expensive suit, lecturing me about building an empire, completely oblivious to the fact that he was financially bleeding to death. He was signing away his future, while I sat across from him with a piece of red sealing wax in my pocket, holding the keys to a $6 million trust he could never touch. The waitress arrived and dropped the laminated check on the table. Paul snatched it up smoothly, pulling a platinum credit card from his leather wallet. He handed it to the waitress with a practiced flourish. We sat in silence for a few minutes. I watched the rain begin to streak the diner windows. The waitress returned her expression apologetic. She placed the platinum card back on the table. "I am sorry, sir." The machine declined the charge. "Do you have another form of payment?" Paul froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale shade of gray. His jaw tightened. He snatched the card off the table, muttering a sharp excuse about a banking error and daily limits. He dug into his pocket, producing a crumpled $20 bill to cover the coffee. The facade had finally cracked. The decoy funds were gone, and the reality of his exorbitant spending had caught up with him. He stood up abruptly, buttoning his blazer with trembling fingers. "I have to go," Paul announced, his voice tight and stripped of all its former arrogance. "I have a meeting across town. A commercial developer is very eager to acquire the old dairy farm. I am securing the contract today." He turned and walked out of the diner, pushing through the glass doors into the cold rain. I stayed in the vinyl booth, watching his sports car speed out of the parking lot. The trap had worked flawlessly. The bait was gone, but a starving parasite will do whatever it takes to find a new source of nourishment. By rushing to sign a commercial real estate contract for a farm he did not own, my father was about to step off a ledge from which he could never return. Marcus Vance was a name whispered with bitter resentment in feed stores and tractor dealerships across southern Wisconsin. He built his corporate empire by identifying vulnerable, multi-generational dairy farms, offering them predatory buyout agreements when milk prices plummeted and paving over their fertile pastures to construct sprawling distribution warehouses. Vance possessed the eyes of a starving wolf and wore bespoke suits that cost more than a combine harvester. He did not negotiate, he devoured. My father drove straight from our uncomfortable diner lunch to the glass and steel headquarters of Vance Agricultural Development. Paul needed cash to maintain his fragile illusion of wealth, and he needed it before the sun set. Sitting in a sterile conference room overlooking the Milwaukee skyline, Paul slid a copy of the forged probate waiver across a polished marble table. He presented the document as irrefutable proof that he was the sole heir to Lucille's 500-acre estate. Paul puffed his chest out, attempting to project the aura of a seasoned tycoon brokering a high-level deal. Vance was no fool. He commanded a legion of corporate attorneys and understood the intricate nuances of property law better than anyone in the state. He likely recognized the probate document was merely a preliminary filing, not a finalized deed. But Vance also recognized something far more valuable sitting across from him. He saw a desperate, sweating man pretending to be powerful. He smelled blood in the water. Instead of a standard real estate purchase, Vance offered Paul an exclusivity agreement. The terms were designed to look like a lifeline while functioning as a guillotine. Vance agreed to hand over a non-refundable cash advance of $150,000 that very afternoon. In exchange, Paul granted Vance the exclusive right to purchase the farm for a fixed below-market price. There was a catch woven into the fine print. The contract contained a poison pill. Paul had exactly 60 days to produce a clean, unencumbered title to the land. If he failed to deliver the deed by that deadline, the agreement mandated a ruinous penalty. Paul would owe Vance the immediate return of the advance, plus a punitive damage fee of $300,000 secured by a lien against every personal asset Paul owned. Paul did not consult an attorney. He did not read the dense paragraphs outlining his impending doom. Blinded by the promise of instant capital and eager to silence the panic gnawing at his stomach, my father picked up a heavy brass pen and signed his name on the dotted line. He invited a ruthless predator directly into our family circle. The moment the wire transfer hit his checking account, the suffocating anxiety vanished from my father's posture. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted the system. He drove home that evening, poured himself a glass of imported scotch, and immediately began writing checks. The influx of capital flowed straight into Paige's spiraling wedding budget. She had recently demanded a string quartet, towering centerpieces of imported white roses, and an open bar featuring top-tier liquors for her upcoming country club engagement party. Paul funded every single request without a second thought. He paid the caterers. He secured the florists. He bought Karen a new pearl necklace to celebrate his supposed business triumph. He was spending the developer's money with the same reckless abandon he used to drain my grandmother's bait estate. 48 hours later, I was sitting in the cramped, windowless break room of the veterinary clinic. The air smelled of burnt coffee and dog treats. My scrubs were stained with iodine from assisting in a difficult canine surgery all morning. I peeled the plastic lid off a cheap yogurt cup when my cell phone vibrated on the metal table. The caller identification displayed the private office number of Kenneth Bradley. I answered, keeping my voice low so the receptionist down the hall could not hear. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bradley." "Good afternoon, Wendy." His deep baritone resonated through the speaker. His tone was sharp, stripped of any conversational warmth. "The county recorder's office just flagged an interesting public filing regarding your grandmother's parcel. A corporate entity known as Vance Agricultural Development has recorded a memorandum of contract against the property." I set my plastic spoon down. The hum of the clinic refrigerator suddenly felt deafening. "A memorandum. Your father signed a binding exclusivity agreement." Bradley explained the rustle of heavy paper echoing on his end of the line. He accepted a 6-figure cash advance. He leveraged the forged probate paperwork to convince a corporate shark he had the legal right to sell the dairy farm. My pulse quickened. The inheritance game had just shifted from a localized family dispute into a sprawling legal nightmare. Did he actually transfer the deed? He cannot transfer a deed he does not possess, Bradley stated flatly. The land is locked safely inside your irrevocable trust. Vance filed the memorandum to establish a public claim, ensuring no one else can purchase the farm, while Paul scrambles to clear the title. But Paul will never clear it. I pressed my fingertips against my forehead, processing the sheer magnitude of my father's arrogance. He took money from Marcus Vance. Everyone in Wisconsin agriculture knows Vance ruins people for sport, precisely, Bradley said. Your father stepped into a bear trap. The contract stipulates a 60-day delivery window for the clean title. When Paul inevitably defaults, Vance will enforce the penalty clauses. This is no longer merely a case of familial theft. Wendy, your father has crossed federal lines. He committed commercial fraud against an entity that possesses the unlimited legal resources to crush him into dust. I reached into my scrub pocket, my fingers wrapping around the chunk of red sealing wax. The cold surface grounded my racing thoughts. Lucille had designed the trap, but Paul had just wired it with high explosives. We do nothing, I replied, my voice steadying. We let the clock run. Bradley let out a low hum of agreement. The snare is set. Let him spend the developer's advance. Let him enjoy his fleeting illusion of grandeur. I will monitor the filings. You focus on maintaining your cover. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting harsh shadows across the break room floor. My parents thought they were untouchable. They paraded around town boasting about their real estate prowess and showering Paige with unearned luxuries. They looked down on my grueling hours at the clinic, treating my silence as proof of my weakness. They had no idea they were dancing on the edge of a jagged cliff. Paul had funded a lavish lifestyle using a loan he could never repay, secured by a property he would never own. The funds were already committed to caterers and florists, vanishing into the extravagant details of an engagement party meant to impress high society elites. Every sip of vintage champagne they took was paid for with fraudulent promises. The stakes were no longer about reclaiming an inheritance. The situation had morphed into an impending criminal catastrophe. I sat in the quiet clinic, staring at the blank wall, calculating the days. The countdown had officially begun. Thieves operate on a jagged edge of constant anxiety. The initial thrill of acquiring stolen wealth soon curdles into a pervasive, creeping paranoia. It infects every interaction, turning quiet moments into potential threats. My mother, Karen, was experiencing this exact psychological rot. She knew exactly how she would react if someone had stolen her life savings. She would scream, file lawsuits, and burn the house down to the foundation. Because I did none of those things, my behavior defied her logic. My placid demeanor was supposed to be a sign of defeat. Yet it started keeping her awake at night. She expected me to beg for scraps from their newfound fortune. She expected me to complain bitterly about my 12-hour shifts at the veterinary clinic while Paige flashed diamond tennis bracelets and planned a high-society wedding. Instead, I offered polite smiles and quiet nods. My lack of friction felt unnatural to her. It bred a dark suspicion in her mind. It was a bruised purple Thursday evening when the knock came. The Wisconsin winter had finally broken, leaving behind a miserable gray slush that coated the streets of Madison. I had just walked through the door of my cramped apartment, my shoulders aching from lifting sedated hounds onto stainless steel surgical tables. My scrubs were stiff with dried antiseptic. The knock on my door was sharp, rapid, and impatient. I peered through the peephole. Karen stood in the drafty hallway clutching a generic bakery box tied with a thin white string. It was a flimsy prop for an uninvited invasion. I unbolted the door. Karen stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She brought a gust of cold air and the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive department store tuberose. She brushed past me, her eyes immediately darting into the corners of my living room, performing a rapid, silent inventory of my meager possessions. "Wendy, darling," she cooed, her tone dripping with artificial warmth. "I was just in the neighborhood looking at some imported tile for the new kitchen island. I realized we have not had a real mother-daughter chat in weeks. I brought pastries." I took the cardboard box from her hands, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Thank you. I was just about to put the kettle on for some tea. Make yourself comfortable." I gestured toward the faded fabric sofa. The kitchenette in my apartment was little more than a narrow alcove separated from the living area by a low breakfast bar. I stepped behind the counter and filled the electric kettle. Above the stove sat a cheap stainless steel microwave. The dark polished glass of its door functioned as a perfect shadowed mirror reflecting the living area behind me. I kept my back turned to my mother, flicked the switch on the kettle, and watched the dark glass. The moment she believed my attention was diverted by the hissing water, the facade of the caring mother vanished. Karen abandoned the sofa. Her movements were swift, silent, and predatory. She glided across the worn carpet, bypassing the bookshelves entirely, and stopped directly in front of my small wooden writing desk. My pulse thrummed a steady, cool rhythm against my ribs. I had been anticipating this exact intrusion for weeks. A thief always returns to check the locks. I watched the microwave reflection as her manicured fingers hovered over my personal space. She sifted through a stack of unopened utility bills, her eyes scanning the return addresses. Finding nothing incriminating, she reached for the brass handle of the top drawer. I poured hot water over a tea bag and a ceramic mug, letting the splashing sound cover the faint screech of the drawer sliding open on its metal tracks. She peered inside. The tension in my chest pulled tight. Just 4 inches below that top drawer was a secondary compartment secured by a heavy brass lock. Inside that locked space rested Kenneth Bradley's business card, my chunk of red sealing wax, and a photocopied summary of the $6 million irrevocable trust. If she noticed the locked compartment, if she demanded a key, the entire inheritance game would detonate prematurely. But I had prepared a feast for her ego, right on top of the desk. Beside a cup of cheap ballpoint pens lay a stack of glossy, low-yield mutual fund brochures I had grabbed from a local credit union lobby. Resting squarely on top of those pamphlets was a yellow legal pad. On that pad, I had meticulously mapped out a pathetic, desperate monthly budget. I had written frantic calculations detailing how I could stretch my veterinary technician's salary by cutting out fresh produce, eating generic ramen, and picking up an extra overnight shift every weekend just to afford a minor car repair. It was a detailed portrait of financial misery. Through the dark glass, I watched Karen pick up the yellow legal pad. Her eyes traced the desperate handwritten arithmetic. The rigid tension coiled in her shoulders instantly dissolved. She let out a soft, almost imperceptible scoff. A smug, deeply condescending smile stretched across her lips. The paranoia that had driven her to my apartment evaporated, replaced by a rush of intoxicating superiority. She saw exactly what she needed to see. She saw a clueless, impoverished daughter struggling to scrape together $50, entirely oblivious to the stolen wealth funding her own family's lavish lifestyle. She carefully placed the legal pad back on the desk, ensuring it looked undisturbed, and practically floated back to the sofa. By the time I turned around with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea, she was sitting with her legs crossed, projecting the serene aura of a queen visiting a peasant. "It is so cozy in here, Wendy," she lied, accepting the warm mug. "But you really should let your father talk to you about wealth management. He is doing such incredible things for Paige. You do not have to live paycheck to paycheck your whole life. There is a whole world of opportunity out there if you just apply yourself." "I know," I replied, staring down at my tea, playing the role of the defeated, exhausted child. "I am trying to learn. It is just so overwhelming to look at the numbers." Karen stayed for another 20 minutes, feeding me hollow platitudes about hard work while she secretly reveled in my fabricated poverty. She patted my hand before walking out the door, leaving my apartment utterly complacent. Her guard had dropped entirely. She was fully convinced that her secret was safe. She thought she had outsmarted me, and she walked to her car, believing the Roberts family was safely ascending to the ranks of high society. She did not realize the ground beneath her feet was already crumbling into dust. The 60-day countdown on Marcus Vance's predatory commercial contract was ticking down with brutal, unforgiving precision. My father had spent the developer's towering cash advance on catering deposits, designer clothes, and premium liquor for Paige's upcoming engagement party. He had purchased a lifestyle using fraudulent promises, assuming he could somehow force a clean title out of thin air. But the title to the 500-acre dairy farm was locked inside a corporate trust he could not touch. The clock was running out. Marcus Vance was not a man who accepted excuses, and he certainly did not accept delays. In a matter of days, the developer's legal team would demand the unencumbered deed. When Paul inevitably failed to produce it, the financial penalty clauses would activate, stripping him of everything he owned. The illusion of their grand wealth was built on a foundation of sand, and the tide was rapidly rolling in. I stood by my apartment window, watching my mother's luxury sedan pull away from the curb and disappear into the dark Wisconsin night. The fluorescent lights of the emergency veterinary clinic hummed a low, persistent buzz that vibrated behind my eyes. I had just finished a brutal 14-hour shift. My shoulders ached from restraining a terrified mastiff, and my hands were raw from repeated scrubbing with harsh iodine soap. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out into the biting Wisconsin evening. The sun had long surrendered to the horizon, leaving behind a bruised indigo sky and a sharp wind that swept across the icy asphalt. I pulled my thin wool scarf tighter around my neck, my breath pluming in white clouds. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few employee vehicles huddled under the pale glow of the sodium street lamps. But parked at a jagged angle taking up 2 spaces right next to my battered sedan was my father's sleek imported sports car. The engine was idling, exhaust curling from the dual tailpipes in thick gray streams. The driver's side door opened before I even reached my bumper. Paul stepped out into the freezing wind. The man who stood before me was a jarring departure from the arrogant tycoon who had lectured me over cheap coffee just a few weeks prior. His expensive camel hair overcoat hung loosely on his shoulders. The knot of his silk tie was pulled askew, and deep dark shadows pooled beneath his eyes. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. The crushing weight of Marcus Vance's impending commercial deadline was physically devouring him from the inside out. He had burned through the stolen Bait estate, he had incinerated the corporate cash advance, and now he was running on fumes and terror. "Wendy," he called out, his voice carrying a frantic, jagged edge that cut through the wind. "I have been waiting for 45 minutes. I stopped at the edge of the curb, maintaining a safe distance. I kept my expression carefully blank, masking the surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. "What are you doing here, Dad?" He closed the car door and shortened the distance between us. I could smell the stale, sour scent of nervous sweat cutting straight through his heavy designer cologne. He forced a stiff, unnatural smile that made his face look hollow. "We need to talk about family business." He began, his words tumbling out too fast. "Paige is getting married in exactly 8 days. The country club is demanding the final balance for the catering and the floral arrangements by tomorrow morning. They are threatening to cancel the entire engagement party if the wire transfer does not clear." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch out. I watched the panic flicker behind his eyes. "I know the party is coming up," I said softly, playing the role of the confused bystander. "But you said you made a fortune on those investments. You said you were operating on an entirely different level." His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking rapidly in his cheek. "Real estate requires liquidity. Wendy, you would know that if you understood basic economics. My capital is tied up in high-yield assets. I am waiting on a substantial payout from the dairy farm sale, but the paperwork is caught in bureaucratic red tape. I just need a bridge to get through the weekend." He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat and produced a thick stack of folded legal papers. He thrust them toward me. The wind caught the edges, making the pages flutter wildly. I glanced down at the bold print on the top sheet. It was an application for a $50,000 personal loan from a high-risk predatory lending institution. The interest rate printed near the bottom margin was staggering. He had exhausted his traditional credit lines. The banks had undoubtedly cut him off, sensing the financial rot spreading beneath his fabricated wealth. He was turning to loan sharks wearing corporate suits, and he needed a fresh victim to secure the debt. "I need a secondary signature," Paul demanded, jabbing his finger at the signature line. "My debt-to-income ratio is temporarily skewed because of the downtown condo purchase. They just need a co-signer with a clean credit history and a steady paycheck. It is a mere formality. I will pay it off the second the farm contract closes." I looked from the predatory loan application up to his desperate, bloodshot eyes. You want me to sign a loan for $50,000, I asked, letting my voice waver slightly to project fear. Dad, I barely make enough to cover my own rent. If you default on this, they will garnish my wages. They will ruin my life. The thin veneer of paternal charm shattered entirely. The panic festering inside him mutated instantly into a vicious, boiling rage. He stepped closer, towering over me, using his physical size to project dominance. "You are already ruining your own life," he spat, his voice rising above the howl of the winter wind. "Look at you. You are 24 years old, wearing stained scrubs, driving a piece of garbage car, and scraping dog feces off linoleum floors for a living. You have zero ambition. You have zero vision. You are a financial failure." Wendy. The venom in his words was visceral, meant to break my spirit and force compliance. He pointed a trembling finger toward the city skyline. "Paige is actually making something of herself," he screamed, the sound echoing across the empty lot. "She is marrying into the elite class. She is elevating this entire family. I have sacrificed everything to give her the wedding she deserves to secure our status, and you are going to stand here and whine about a signature. You owe this family. You owe me. Sign the paper." He shoved a gold-plated pen toward my chest. The freezing wind bit at my exposed cheeks, but I felt nothing but a roaring heat radiating from my core. The psychological abuse washed over me in waves, thick and suffocating. The urge to break my silence was an agonizing physical pressure building in the back of my throat. I wanted to snatch the loan application from his hands, rip it to shreds, and scream the undeniable truth into his arrogant face. I wanted to tell him that his grand dairy farm sale was a phantom. I wanted to tell him that the developer he feared was going to crush him because of a trap I had orchestrated. I wanted to declare that I was sitting on an impenetrable $6 million trust while he was begging for scraps in a frozen parking lot. I reached my bare hand into the deep pocket of my winter coat. My freezing fingers wrapped around the small, hard chunk of red sealing wax Grandmother Lucille had left inside the vintage tin. The smooth, uneven surface grounded me instantly. True power does not require screaming. True power requires unshakable, unbreakable discipline. If I dropped the hammer now, I would relieve his ignorance. I would give him time to run, time to hide, or time to prepare a legal defense. I had to let him walk blindly into the execution chamber he had built for himself. I slowly pulled my hand away from the gold pen. I squared my shoulders, looking my father dead in his bloodshot, terrified eyes. I absorbed every ounce of his venom, filtering it through the cold reality of my hidden empire. No. The single syllable dropped from my lips like a stone sinking into a frozen lake, flat, final, devoid of any emotion or apology. Paul froze. He stared at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. The refusal simply did not compute in his mind. He was so accustomed to bulldozing over my boundaries that a direct denial short-circuited his brain. "What did you just say to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and fury. "I will not sign it," I repeated, keeping my gaze locked on his. "I am not funding Paige's party." His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "You ungrateful, selfish little brat!" he roared, throwing his arms up in the air. The loan papers slipped from his grasp, scattering across the icy asphalt like dead leaves. "I should have known you would pull a stunt like this. You have always been jealous of your sister. You have always been a bitter disappointment." He stepped back, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "If you walk away from this, you are done." He threatened, his words dripping with pure malice. "You are no longer part of this family. Do not call us. Do not show up at the wedding. You are entirely on your own. I am cutting you out forever." He turned on his heel, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on a patch of black ice. He yanked the door of his sports car open, threw himself into the driver's seat, and slammed the door with enough force to rattle the windows. The engine roared to life, tires spinning wildly on the frozen pavement before finding traction. He sped out of the parking lot, blowing through a stop sign and disappearing into the dark Wisconsin night. I stood alone in the cold, watching the red taillights fade into the distance. The scattered loan documents fluttered around my boots. He thought he had just delivered the ultimate punishment. He thought he was banishing me from the kingdom. He did not realize he was merely locking himself inside a burning building. My father had reached the very bottom of his financial barrel. His credit was obliterated. His cash was gone. His pride was shattered. The engagement party was only days away, and the caterers were demanding payment. The walls were closing in on my father, shrinking his fabricated empire inch by agonizing inch. Marcus Vance was not a man who tolerated delays. According to the updates Kenneth Bradley provided me, the developer's legal team had initiated a relentless campaign of phone calls and formal inquiries. Vance had surveyors idling their trucks on the county road bordering the dairy farm, their engines running, waiting for the green light to tear into the frost-hardened Wisconsin soil. They needed the clean title to break ground, and Paul had nothing to offer but empty promises. I witnessed the resulting panic firsthand on a bleak Thursday afternoon. My mother had summoned me to their home under the guise of an urgent family meeting. The text message she sent carried a sharp, authoritative tone, demanding my presence before my evening shift at the veterinary clinic. I parked my battered sedan on the street, avoiding the oil stains left by Paul's expensive idle sports car in the driveway. The walk up to the front porch felt different this time. The air held a heavy, brittle tension. When I pushed the front door open, the silence inside the house was stifling. I walked into the kitchen and found a scene of suspended ruin. The contractors Karen had hired to install the imported Italian marble countertops had abandoned the job. Bare plywood stretched across half the center island, exposed and unfinished. A fine layer of construction dust coated the stainless steel appliances. The checks had undoubtedly bounced. Paul stood near the frosted glass window overlooking the backyard, a cell phone pressed hard against his ear. His knuckles were white. The camel hair overcoat was gone, replaced by a wrinkled dress shirt, the collar unbuttoned. He looked 10 years older than he had in the diner. "I just need 48 hours." Marcus Paul pleaded into the receiver, his voice a tight, high-pitched rasp. "The county clerk is dealing with a backlog of probate files. You know how these municipal offices operate in the spring. The deed is secured. I just need the physical stamp." He listened for a moment, his eyes darting frantically around the unfinished kitchen. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. "No, that penalty clause was contingent on reasonable processing times," Paul stammered, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "You cannot file a lien yet. We have a partnership." Whoever was on the other end of the line ended the call. Paul stared at the dark screen of his phone, his chest heaving with shallow, erratic breaths. He tossed the device onto the dusty plywood island. It landed with a hollow clatter. He turned and noticed me standing in the doorway. The raw terror in his eyes morphed instantly into a hard, defensive glare. He straightened his spine, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. Karen stepped out of the adjacent living room. She wore a tailored cashmere sweater, but her makeup was uneven, attempting to conceal the dark circles bruising the delicate skin under her eyes. She carried a familiar manila folder. "Sit down, Wendy," my mother instructed, pointing to a single wooden stool near the breakfast bar. Her voice lacked its usual condescending lilt. It sounded brittle, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. I remained standing, leaning my hip against the doorframe. "I am fine right here. I have to be at the clinic in an hour. What is this about?" Paul marched across the kitchen, closing the distance between us. He snatched the manila folder from Karen's hands and slapped it down onto the plywood counter. It was the same high-interest personal loan application he had tried to force upon me in the frozen parking lot. "This is about loyalty." Paul declared, his tone harsh and desperate. "This is about whether or not you are truly a part of this family. Paige's engagement party is tomorrow night. The country club management called this morning. They are threatening to lock the doors and turn our guests away if the final catering balance is not paid in full by noon tomorrow." He pushed the paperwork closer to the edge of the counter, tapping the signature line with a rigid index finger. "You are going to sign as my guarantor," Paul demanded, stripping away any pretense of asking a favor. "I am liquidating a vast agricultural asset next week. The payout will cover this bridge loan 10 times over, but right now we are facing a temporary cash flow disruption." I looked at the paperwork, then up at my mother. Karen crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin to project superiority. "We have given you everything," Wendy Karen stated. her voice trembling with manufactured indignation. "We put a roof over your head for 18 years. We tolerated your lack of ambition. We smiled while you threw your life away cleaning cages. Now your sister is on the verge of securing her future with a prominent, respected family. She is elevating our status. You owe us this signature." The sheer audacity of her logic hung in the dusty air. They had forged my name to steal $800,000 of my grandmother's hard-earned legacy. They had incinerated that money on luxury cars, vacations, and designer clothes to impress people they despised. And now, facing the catastrophic consequences of their own unhinged greed, they expected me to shackle myself to a predatory loan to keep their sinking ship afloat for one more night. "And if I refuse?" I asked, keeping my tone mild, letting the silence stretch tightly across the room. Paul leaned his hands on the plywood, leaning toward me. His breath smelled of stale coffee and fear. "Then you are finished," he growled, enunciating every syllable. "If you walk out that door without signing, do not bother showing up at the Madison Country Club tomorrow. Do not call us. Do not expect an invitation to the wedding. You will be exiled from this family. You will be dead to us." He delivered the ultimatum, expecting to see panic fracture my composure. He assumed the threat of isolation would break me. He believed my childhood conditioning, the ingrained desire for parental approval, would override my common sense. He was wrong. Standing in that unfinished kitchen, surrounded by the rotting remains of their fabricated wealth, the final lingering shackles of my upbringing simply dissolved. I felt a profound, chilling liberation wash over me. I realized with sharp clarity that they viewed love solely as a transactional asset. I was never a daughter to them. I was a resource. I was a tool to be leveraged, manipulated, and discarded the moment my utility expired. They did not want a relationship. They wanted a human shield to absorb the impact of their impending ruin. I looked at my father's desperate, sweating face. I looked at my mother's brittle, judgmental sneer. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, undeniable weight of the justice I was about to deliver. "I will not sign the paper," I said, my voice steady, carrying the firm resonance of a judge reading a verdict. "And you do not need to worry about exile. I know exactly where I stand." I turned my back on them and walked out the front door. Behind me, I heard the sharp, furious crash of Paul sweeping the loan documents and a ceramic mug off the counter, the items shattering against the hardwood floor. I drove straight back to my cramped apartment. The winter draft rattled the thin window panes, but the space felt warmer, safer than it ever had before. I took off my heavy coat and walked over to my writing desk. Resting in a silver frame was a photograph of Grandmother Lucille. She was standing in front of the red barn on the dairy farm, wearing her scuffed work boots and a faded denim jacket. She was smiling, holding a newborn calf. Her eyes held that sharp, perceptive gleam, the look of a woman who understood the true value of hard work and the undeniable rot of unearned entitlement. She had seen this exact moment coming 5 years ago. She had built a fortress to protect her legacy, and she had trusted me to hold the keys. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the piece of hardened red sealing wax. I set it gently on the desk next to the photograph. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked middle child forced to endure endless lectures about my inadequacy. I was the sole executor of Lucille Roberts's unyielding justice. I picked up my cell phone and opened my encrypted text thread with attorney Kenneth Bradley. The cursor blinked steadily against the bright screen. I typed out a single definitive command, ensuring there was no room for hesitation or delay. "The parasite is starving. Drop the anvil at the country club tomorrow." I hit send and watched the message turn green as it shot through the digital ether toward Milwaukee. The storm had officially gathered. The dark clouds of Marcus Vance's corporate fury and the district attorney's impending fraud investigation were swirling just above my parents' heads. They were preparing to put on their finest tailored suits and silk gowns, intending to toast to their brilliant success in front of the city's elite. They had no idea that the forecast for their grand celebration called for total, inescapable ruin. The narrative loop closed here. 4 months of calculated silence of watching my family devour my grandmother's Bate estate culminated in this singular echoing room. I stood in the shadows near the terrace doors of the Madison Country Club, returning to the very moment this ordeal began. The ballroom smelled of roasted tenderloin, imported champagne, and Paige's signature jasmine perfume. The floral scent hung in the air so thick it coated the back of my throat, masking the subtle odors of starched linen and warm candle wax. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured prismatic light over a sea of tailored suits and silk dresses. Waiters in crisp white jackets circled the perimeter carrying silver trays loaded with intricate hors d'oeuvres. At the head table, Paul stood tall. A sprawling, extravagant arrangement of imported white orchids framed his shoulders. He tapped a silver fork against his crystal flute. The string quartet in the corner ceased playing. The low, buzzing hum of high society conversation faded into an expectant, breathless hush. He offered a practiced, camera-ready smile to Derek's wealthy parents seated at the adjacent table. The Harrisons represented old Wisconsin money. Having built a logistics empire over 3 generations, they wore understated, tailored garments, a sharp contrast to my mother Karen, who sat beside Paul draped in flashy, newly purchased diamond jewelry. Karen was trying far too hard to fit in her desperation, leaking through her overly bright, rigid posture. Paul adjusted his silk tie and leaned toward the discreet microphone clipped to his lapel. "Family and esteemed guests," Paul began, his voice amplified, dripping with false humility. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the union of 2 wonderful lineages. When I look at Paige and Derek, I see the future. I see the undeniable results of tireless dedication and visionary planning." I leaned against the cool plaster of the archway, my fingers tracing the smooth, hardened edge of the red sealing wax, hidden deep in my pocket. Building an enduring legacy requires foresight. Paul continued, gesturing expansively with his free hand. "It requires seeing immense value where others see only dirt and exhaustion. Recently, I finalized the acquisition of a 500-acre agricultural tract. For generations, that land sat dormant, underutilized by those who lacked the courage to modernize. I am proud to say I am transforming that dormant soil into a thriving commercial hub, securing our family's standing for decades to come." A quiet, sickening wave of disgust rolled through my chest. He was talking about Lucille. He was standing in front of 200 local elites, wearing a tuxedo, purchased with forged money, and erasing my grandmother's lifetime of calloused hands and early mornings in the dairy barn. He rebranded her grueling, honest labor as a failure of vision, claiming her heritage as his own genius invention. I did not let the anger take root. Anger is undisciplined. I let the cold, clinical reality of my hidden empire wash over me instead. I stepped out of the shadows. I wore simple black slacks and a dark tailored blazer. My polished leather boots struck the hardwood floor with a steady rhythmic cadence. I held a plain manila folder in my left hand. My emotional control was absolute. I did not yell. I did not cry. My pulse maintained a steady resting rhythm, calm and deliberate. The guests seated at the tables nearest the terrace noticed me first. The polite smiles on their faces faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, passing from table to table, like a sudden chilling draft sweeping through the warm room. Derek's mother, an austere woman wearing a string of flawless pearls, raised a manicured eyebrow. Her gaze shifted from my practical boots to my father's face. Karen saw me when I reached the center aisle. Her jaw dropped. The champagne flute in her hand tilted, spilling a few drops of pale gold liquid onto the pristine white tablecloth. She had assumed her cruel ultimatum had worked. She truly believed the threat of exile had banished me to my apartment, terrified and defeated. Paige glared at me, her cheeks flushing a blotchy, furious crimson beneath her expensive, professionally applied makeup. She silently mouthed a command for me to leave her hands gripping the edge of the table. Paul stopped speaking mid-sentence. The microphone picked up his sudden sharp intake of breath. The confident, booming orator vanished in an instant, replaced by a man staring at a ghost. His eyes darted toward the security guards stationed near the exits, hoping they would intercept me, but I was already too close. I reached the head table. The silence in the ballroom grew heavy and suffocating. 200 pairs of eyes watched my every move. I did not look at Derek. I did not spare a glance for Paige or Karen. I locked my gaze solely on the man who had threatened to ruin my life over a predatory loan just 24 hours earlier. I placed the manila folder onto the white linen, setting it directly over his empty salad plate. I flipped the cover open, revealing the thick premium parchment inside. The state seal was embossed near the top margin, catching the light from the chandeliers above. "You cannot sell land you do not own." "Dad," I said. My voice was neither loud nor frantic, yet the acoustics of the silent room carried the words with piercing clarity. They echoed off the high ceiling, reaching the ears of every investor socialite and family member present. Paul lowered his gaze to the paper. His arrogant, practiced smile dissolved, the muscles in his face going entirely slack. His eyes scanned the bold, capitalized header printed across the top of the document. Lucille Roberts, Irrevocable Trust. He read the lines below the header. He saw my name listed as the sole, unchallengeable beneficiary. He saw the date of the transfer enacted 5 full years before he ever forged a signature on a probate waiver. The realization struck him with undeniable physical force. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His hands began to tremble. The staggering commercial contract he had signed with Marcus Vance, the towering cash advance he had spent to fund this very party, the grand promises he had just made to the Harrison family, all of it rested on a foundation of empty air. He had wagered his entire existence, his freedom and his reputation, on an asset he had never possessed. He had spent months playing the role of a king, unaware he was sitting on a throne of dry kindling. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide and unfocused. He opened his mouth, his jaw working as he tried desperately to form a coherent word, to spin a lie to salvage the burning wreckage of his pride in front of his future in-laws. Before a single syllable could escape his throat, a heavy, resounding crash echoed from the rear of the hall. The towering mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open, striking the brass wall stops with a deafening crack that made half the room jump in their seats. The heavy mahogany doors struck the brass wall stops with a deafening crack. Every head in the Madison Country Club ballroom turned toward the entrance. Framed in the archway stood Kenneth Bradley. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. Flanking him were 2 junior associates carrying thick, brass-latched leather briefcases. They moved forward with synchronized clinical precision. Their polished dress shoes clicked a steady, unyielding rhythm against the hardwood floor. The crowd of local elite socialites and investors parted instinctively, stepping aside, as if making way for an executioner. Bradley bypassed the bewildered guests and marched directly toward the head table. He stopped right beside me, presenting a unified, formidable front. He did not spare a single glance for the towering floral arrangements, the tiered fondant cake, or the terrified faces of my mother and sister. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a pair of silver-rimmed reading glasses, and addressed the silent room. "Good evening," Bradley announced. His deep baritone voice carried effortlessly, requiring no microphone. "My name is Kenneth Bradley. I am the senior partner at Bradley & Associates, acting as the appointed legal trustee for the Lucille Roberts estate. I also serve as the primary legal counsel for her sole designated beneficiary, Wendy Roberts." A collective gasp rippled through the tables nearest the dance floor. At the adjacent table, Derek's father set his crystal champagne flute down with a sharp clink that echoed in the quiet space. The Harrison family, representing generations of old Wisconsin money, sat rigidly sensing a scandal of unprecedented proportions. Paul leaned heavily against the linen-draped table, his knuckles turning a stark shade of white. The confident, booming orator from 30 seconds ago had vanished. In his place stood a cornered, panicked fraud. "You have no jurisdiction here," Paul stammered. His voice lacked its previous resonance, cracking under the sudden pressure. "This is a private event. I am the head of this family. I just brokered a major commercial land deal securing our financial future. Security needs to escort this man out." No one moved. The security guards stationed near the exits remained planted, recognizing the unmistakable authority of a high-powered legal team. Bradley offered a faint, pitying smile. It was the look a predator gives wounded prey. "You brokered nothing," Paul Bradley corrected, opening the manila folder I had placed on the table. "You signed a predatory exclusivity contract with Vance Agricultural Development, promising a clean title you do not hold. Lucille Roberts placed her 500-acre dairy farm alongside her lucrative agricultural patents into an impenetrable, irrevocable trust 5 years ago. You just accepted a six-figure corporate advance for a phantom asset. You committed commercial fraud against a developer who will dedicate boundless resources to dismantling your life. Paul's knees buckled. He grabbed the back of Paige's chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor. Paige stared at her father, her meticulously applied makeup, unable to hide the dawning terror stretching across her features. Karen pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her face flashing from flushed pink to a sickly ashen gray. The imported Italian marble countertops, the luxury vacations, the designer wardrobe, every purchase flashed before her eyes as the foundation of their artificial wealth crumbled into dust. But Paul possessed the perilous instinct to fight when trapped. Desperate to salvage his pride in front of the Harrison family, he puffed out his chest, attempting to project a false aura of control. "This is a misunderstanding," Paul shouted, his voice shrill and echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "A minor bureaucratic oversight on the real estate side, but I am still a wealthy man. I am the legal executor of my mother's liquid estate, $800,000. Wendy is just a jealous, unstable girl trying to ruin her sister's special night because she cleans animal cages for a living and cannot stand our success." I did not flinch. I let him dig the hole a few feet deeper. I reached into my pocket, running my thumb over the smooth surface of the red sealing wax. Bradley did not argue. He simply raised his hand, signaling his junior associate. The young lawyer stepped forward, unclasped his briefcase, and handed Bradley a slender, red-tabbed file. The $800,000, Bradley stated, his tone dropping to a chilling, conversational level, was a beta state. The ballroom grew so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. "Lucille Roberts knew you possessed a severe moral deficit." Bradley continued opening the red file. "She intentionally left those funds vulnerable in basic checking and savings accounts, constructing a legal tripwire. She wanted to see if you would attempt to steal the loose change on the table." Bradley extracted a series of enlarged, high-resolution photographs and dropped them onto the white linen tablecloth right next to Paul's empty salad plate. "This is a forensic handwriting analysis conducted by a court-appointed expert," Bradley explained, tapping the glossy photos. "It details the probate waiver filed 4 months ago in Dane County. The signature relinquishing Wendy's rights was forged. The pen pressure, the stroke velocity, and the microscopic ink pooling traced directly back to your hand, Paul." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Derek stood up from his chair, his face pale, his eyes locked on the forensic evidence. "Forged," Derek repeated, his voice laced with disgust. He looked at Paige. Paige shrank back, her hands shaking so intensely her diamond tennis bracelet rattled against the porcelain plates. "By executing that forgery," Bradley declared, turning his flinty gaze back to my father, "you triggered a specific fraud clause woven into the fabric of the main trust. Any family member who attempts to defraud the designated heir forfeits all future claims arbitration rights are standing. You legally disinherited yourselves the moment you signed her name." Karen let out a low, guttural sob, collapsing into her seat. She buried her face in her hands, the illusion of her high society status shattering beyond repair. Furthermore, Bradley leaned closer, delivering the ultimate payload with ruthless precision. "You transferred those stolen funds across state and county lines. You used electronic banking channels to purchase luxury vehicles, vacations, and real estate deposits. That elevates a local inheritance dispute into federal wire fraud. You did not secure a legacy, Paul. You secured multiple felony indictments." The truth detonated in the room. The shockwave stripped away every lie, every boast, and every gaslighting comment they had weaponized against me over the past 4 months. Paul stared at the forensic photos, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He looked like a fish pulled from the lake, suffocating in the open air. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. The tailored tuxedo he wore suddenly looked like a stolen costume. The guests began whispering frantically. The sound swelled into a loud, buzzing cacophony of judgment. The local elites, the people my parents had desperately tried to impress, were now looking at them as if they were carrying a highly contagious disease. Cell phones emerged from purses as socialites began texting the scandalous details to anyone not in attendance. The carefully constructed facade of the Roberts family lay in irrecoverable ruins on the ballroom floor. They had burned through the bait money they had triggered the trap, and now they had to pay the toll. But the devastation was not yet finished. The legal hammer had fallen, but the social and financial consequences were just beginning to arrive. From the back of the murmuring crowd, a tall man in a dark, expensive suit began pushing his way toward the head table, his eyes fixed squarely on my father. It was Marcus Vance, and he did not look happy. Meanwhile, Derek stepped away from his family's table, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a look of pure revulsion. The trap had snapped shut, leaving the predators nowhere left to run. The murmuring crowd parted like a severed tide. A man stepped forward from the shadows near the rear bar. Marcus Vance wore a midnight blue suit, cut so sharply it seemed to carve the air around him. My father had invited the corporate developer as a VIP guest. Paul wanted to parade the shark around the country club, intending to prove to the local elites that the Roberts family operated in the upper echelons of commercial real estate. Instead, Paul had provided a front-row seat to his own public execution. Vance did not rush. He walked with the measured, unhurried stride of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. His leather shoes clicked against the hardwood, silencing the remaining whispers in the room. He stopped 3 feet away from the head table, his flinty eyes locked onto my father's ashen face. "You invited me here to celebrate a merger." Paul Vance set his voice a low, gravelly hum that projected effortlessly across the silent tables. "You sat in my boardroom and guaranteed an unencumbered deed. You took a 6-figure corporate advance based on a forged county waiver." Paul opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but his vocal cords refused to produce the sound. He raised a shaking hand, as if trying to physically ward off the impending destruction. "My legal team is watching this play out," Vance continued, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the room where a man in a gray suit tapped rapidly on a smartphone. "We are drafting the injunctions tonight. On Monday morning, we will file a civil suit for breach of contract and severe commercial fraud. We will trigger the penalty clauses you signed without reading. I am placing a lien on your primary residence. I am freezing your brokerage accounts. I will seize the cars in your driveway and the furniture in your living room. By the time my firm finishes stripping your assets, you will not have enough capital left to buy a cup of coffee." The developer did not yell. He delivered the threat with clinical, terrifying indifference. He turned his back on my father, dismissing him as a worthless liability, and walked out of the ballroom. The finality of Vance's words hung over the head table like a shroud. The illusion of safety evaporated. Paige stood frozen, her eyes wide, darting between the empty doorway and her father. The reality of the situation crashed into her sheltered mind. The luxury condo, the designer wardrobe, the endless stream of stolen cash, funding her entire identity had just vanished into thin air. She snapped. Paige let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that rattled the crystal glassware. She slammed both hands onto the linen tablecloth, overturning a towering centerpiece. A dozen imported white orchids crashed onto the floor, the glass vase shattering into jagged shards. Water pooled around Paul's expensive dress shoes. "This is not happening!" Paige shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain. She grabbed a silver butter knife and hurled it across the table. It clattered against a china plate. "You ruined everything, Wendy. You planned this just to destroy my perfect life." She looked around wildly, her chest heaving. She expected someone to intervene. She expected her mother to comfort her, but Karen was currently slumped sideways in her chair. My mother clutched her chest, her mouth open in a silent gaping O. She was hyperventilating, struggling to pull oxygen into her tightening lungs. The socialite status she craved so desperately had just transformed into a grotesque public spectacle. Paige turned her desperate gaze toward the adjacent table. She looked at Derek Harrison. Derek was a calculating man. He had proposed to Paige because my father successfully projected the image of a rising real estate mogul. The Harrison family logistics empire demanded unblemished reputations and strategic alliances. Derek watched the chaos unfolding before him. I could almost see the gears turning behind his cold blue eyes. He was running a rapid risk assessment. He calculated the social fallout of tying his pristine family name to a clan of broke, soon-to-be-indicted felons. The math did not work in Paige's favor. Derek stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. He did not look angry. He looked repulsed. "Derek, please." Paige begged, her voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whimper. She stepped around the spilled water, reaching a hand out toward him. "It is just a misunderstanding. My dad will fix it. We can still go to the Bahamas for the honeymoon. Everything is paid for." Derek stared at her outstretched hand as if it were covered in toxic waste. He stepped past her, ignoring her entirely. He walked up to the head table and picked up the microphone Paul had abandoned near the floral arrangement. The feedback squealed briefly, forcing the guests to wince. Derek held the microphone steady. Due to unforeseen and highly unfortunate circumstances, Derek announced to the room, his tone flat and devoid of any lingering affection. "This celebration is over. The engagement is canceled. I apologize to our guests for the inconvenience. Please have a safe drive home." He set the microphone down on the table. The dull thud sounded like a judge dropping a gavel. Derek turned to his parents. His mother, her face an unreadable mask of wealthy stoicism, simply nodded. The Harrison family stood in unison. They did not say goodbye. They turned their backs on the wreckage and walked out of the Madison Country Club, preserving their dignity by severing ties immediately and permanently. Paige watched them leave, her eyes hollow. A ragged, guttural sob ripped from her throat. Her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, the expensive silk of her designer dress pooling around her in the spilled water and broken glass. She buried her face in her hands, weeping with the raw, unfiltered panic of a spoiled child who just realized her toys were gone forever. Paul remained standing at the table, but he looked like an empty shell. His posture had collapsed. The arrogant tycoon was dead. Only a terrified, broken man remained, staring blankly at the ruined cake and the departing guests. I stood tall in the center of the devastation. I reached my right hand into the pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingertips brushed against the uneven surface of the red ceiling wax Grandmother Lucille had hidden inside that vintage tin. The cool, solid texture anchored me. I felt no pity for the sobbing woman on the floor. I felt no sorrow for the hyperventilating mother or the catatonic father. They had chosen this path the moment they decided my signature was an obstacle to be forged rather than respected. They had dug a pit, filled it with their own bottomless greed, and willingly jumped inside. The villains of my story had been ruined entirely by their own unyielding hubris. I turned away from the head table. I did not look back as I walked down the center aisle. The remaining guests parted for me, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, crossed the carpeted lobby, and stepped out into the crisp Wisconsin night. The cold air hit my face clean and sharp. The scent of pine needles and damp earth drifted from the nearby golf course, reminding me of the sprawling dairy farm, waiting for my return. The heavy, suffocating silence I had carried for 4 months lifted from my shoulders, dissolving into the winter wind. I walked toward my battered car, the crunch of gravel under my boots providing a steady, victorious rhythm. The immediate threat was neutralized, and the truth was now public record. But human desperation is a dangerous and unpredictable force. Paul and Karen were about to wake up to frozen bank accounts, canceled credit lines, and looming criminal indictments. When predators find themselves backed into a corner with zero avenues of escape, they drop all remaining pretenses. They do whatever it takes to survive. 72 hours passed since the crystal chandeliers of the Madison Country Club witnessed the destruction of the Roberts family facade. 3 days of profound shifting silence followed. I returned to my shifts at the veterinary clinic. I found comfort in the predictable routines of drawing blood sterilizing instruments and listening to the steady rhythm of a canine heartbeat through a cold stethoscope. My world remained anchored in reality. Beyond the clinic walls, however, a legal hurricane tore through the lives of the people who forged my signature. Marcus Vance did not issue empty threats. His corporate attorneys executed their promises with lethal efficiency. By Monday morning, injunctions hit the local banks. The developer sought immediate restitution for the breached exclusivity contract. On Wednesday evening, a freezing rain swept off Lake Mendota, lashing against the thin window panes of my second-floor apartment. I sat on my faded sofa, sipping hot tea, reading a textbook on advanced dairy herd management. A knock sounded at my front door. It lacked the sharp, demanding authority my mother usually projected. This knock was erratic, faint, and steeped in desperation. It sounded like someone treading water, struggling to keep their head above the surface. I set my mug down. The ceramic clicked against the wooden coffee table. I walked across the worn carpet and pressed my eye against the peephole. Paul and Karen stood in the drafty hallway. The transformation they had undergone in just 3 days was jarring. The polished, arrogant tycoons who had toasted to their own brilliance were gone. In their place stood 2 broken, terrified individuals stripped of their armor. I slid the deadbolt back and opened the door a few inches, keeping my body centered in the frame. The harsh fluorescent light of the corridor illuminated the depth of their ruin. Paul wore a rumpled dress shirt that looked unwashed. His shoulders slumped forward, defeated by an invisible, crushing weight. He had not shaved. Dark, bruised shadows circled his bloodshot eyes. Karen stood slightly behind him, clutching her designer purse against her chest like a shield. The leather looked dull. Her hair hung limp around her face, the gray roots visible near the part. She wore no makeup to hide the deep lines of stress etched around her mouth. Wendy Paul rasped, his voice cracking. He sounded parched, his throat dry from endless panicked phone calls. "Please let us come inside." I did not move. I rested my hand on the edge of the door, maintaining a solid physical barrier. "We can speak right here," I replied. My tone remained flat, devoid of any comforting inflection. Paul swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked down at his scuffed shoes before meeting my gaze. Vance froze everything. He whispered the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic confession. His lawyers secured a preliminary injunction pending the fraud suit. The banks locked our checking accounts. They froze the brokerage portfolios. I tried to buy a tank of gas this afternoon, and the machine declined the transaction. "We have nothing, Wendy. Zero liquidity." He reached a trembling hand out, grasping the edge of the doorframe. "The developer is demanding the full return of the cash advance plus the punitive damage fee by Friday afternoon. If the wire transfer does not clear, Vance's attorneys are taking the forged probate waiver straight to the district attorney. They are handing over the evidence Kenneth Bradley presented at the party." Karen stepped forward, pushing past Paul's shoulder. Tears pooled in her eyes, spilling over her pale cheeks. These were not tears of sorrow for the betrayal she committed. They were tears of pure, unadulterated fear. The impending reality of concrete cells and metal bars had finally pierced her delusion. "They are talking about prison time. Wendy." Karen sobbed, her voice hitching. "Federal wire fraud forgery. Paul could face years behind bars. I could lose my freedom. Paige is locked in her apartment, refusing to speak to us. We have nowhere else to turn." She reached out her fingers, brushing the sleeve of my scrub top. "You possess $6 million. That trust is overflowing with assets. We are only asking for a fraction. Liquidate a small percentage. Give us just enough to pay off Vance and silence the country club caterers. You will barely even notice the money is gone, but it will save our lives." Paul nodded eagerly, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hope. "It is a drop in the bucket for you now, Wendy. Be the bigger person. Save us from this nightmare." This was the ultimate psychological test. For 24 years, society and upbringing had conditioned me to believe that blood dictated unwavering loyalty. The unspoken rule demanded a daughter must sacrifice her own well-being to rescue her parents from the consequences of their actions. The cultural weight of putting family first pressed down on my shoulders. Karen weaponized that exact sentiment, twisting the knife to inflict maximum guilt. Lucille would not want to see her own son locked in a prison cell. Karen cried, her tears flowing faster. She loved this family. She would want us to forgive each other. "Please, Wendy, be a family with us again." I stood in the doorway, letting her words hang in the cold air between us. I looked at the 2 people who had stolen my inheritance without a second thought. I remembered the chilling ease with which they had faked my signature. I recalled Paul standing in the freezing clinic parking lot, screaming that I was a financial failure and threatening to exile me over a predatory loan. They did not view me as a daughter when they were spending the cash. They only remembered we shared a bloodline when they needed a human shield to absorb the bullets they had fired. I reached into my pocket. My fingertips found the familiar, uneven surface of the red sealing wax. The cold chunk of history grounded me, reminding me of the brilliant, uncompromising woman who had designed this very trap. Lucille did not build a $6 million fortress so I could dismantle it to pay off a corporate shark on behalf of thieves. The final lingering thread of my childhood guilt snapped cleanly in two. I looked my father dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to deliver the fatal blow. My words emerged as a whisper of unyielding finality. "Grandma left the bait," I said softly, "but you chose to bite it." Paul's jaw slacked. The desperate hope in his eyes shattered, replaced by a dark, hollow realization. He finally understood that the well of my forgiveness had run dry. "I am not saving you from the monster you invited in." I finished. Karen let out a sharp, devastated wail, reaching both hands out toward me. I stepped back into my apartment and slowly, deliberately pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed down the quiet hallway like a gunshot. I stood alone in my living room, listening to the muffled sounds of my mother weeping on the other side of the wood. Paul pounded his fist against the frame once a weak, defeated thud before his footsteps shuffled away down the corridor. For months, my silence had been a trauma response. It had been a tactical maneuver to survive while living in the shadow of their arrogance. Now, as I walked toward my kitchen to pour another cup of tea, the silence in my apartment felt fundamentally different. It was no longer a shield. It was my ultimate impenetrable boundary. The Roberts family toxicity ended at my front doorstep. I had secured my borders, but the machinery of the justice system was already grinding into motion. Vance's deadline was set for Friday afternoon. When my father failed to deliver the funds, the corporate attorneys would march straight to the authorities. The civil lawsuits and the criminal indictments were barreling toward my parents like a runaway freight train. What would remain of their shattered lives when the district attorney finally knocked on their door with handcuffs instead of demands? Friday afternoon passed with a quiet, devastating certainty. The deadline Marcus Vance established expired at exactly 5 p.m. My father did not wire the required funds because those funds no longer existed. The corporate developer did not issue a second warning or grant a sudden extension. He instructed his legal team to execute the contingency plan. They carried the forged probate documents and the breached commercial contract directly to the Dane County District Attorney. The justice system moves slowly until it decides to strike with crushing force. Early Monday morning, while I was preparing surgical trays at the veterinary clinic, 2 unmarked sedans parked outside my parents' suburban house. Investigators knocked on the front door just as the neighbors stepped out to collect their morning newspapers. The spectacle was stark and undeniable. Paul and Karen were escorted down their driveway in handcuffs. The cold steel bound their wrists over the expensive fabric of their designer coats. My father attempted to smooth talk, the stoic officers offering desperate rationalizations, but his words dissolved into the freezing wind. My mother simply wept into her collar, hiding her face from the peering eyes of the community she had tried so hard to impress. The neighbors watched from behind parted living room curtains, their whispers sealing the social doom of the Roberts family. Weeks melted into months of grueling legal proceedings inside the Dane County Courthouse. The air in the courtroom always smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Kenneth Bradley provided the prosecution with the forensic handwriting analysis and the detailed wire transfer logs. The evidence was irrefutable, leaving the defense attorney with zero leverage. Facing the terrifying prospect of a federal trial and a lengthy stint in a penitentiary, Paul and Karen capitulated. They stood before a stern judge and signed a comprehensive plea agreement. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing thud. The sentence mandated 5 years of supervised probation coupled with severe, lifelong financial restitution. They avoided a prison cell, but they entered a different kind of cage. The criminal convictions served as the final nail in their social coffin, but the civil lawsuits buried them financially. To satisfy the ruinous penalty clauses from the breached exclusivity contract and to cover their mounting legal fees, the bank foreclosed on their primary residence. The house where I grew up was auctioned off at a severe loss. They packed their remaining possessions into rented cardboard boxes, hauling the heavy loads themselves because they could no longer afford hired movers. They relocated to a cramped, drafty rental unit situated on the industrial outskirts of Madison. The new neighborhood offered a grim, sensory landscape. The air smelled of diesel exhaust from passing freight trucks and the metallic tang of a nearby manufacturing plant. The sprawling, manicured backyard they once used to host cocktail parties was replaced by a cracked concrete patio overlooking a rusted chain-link fence. Inside the apartment, peeling linoleum lined the kitchen floor, and the thin walls vibrated every time a commercial train rattled down the nearby tracks. The fallout hit Paige with a sudden, unforgiving reality check. Her artificial high society status dissolved overnight. Without the stolen Beta estate to float her lifestyle, her creditors came collecting. I heard the details later from a mutual acquaintance who witnessed the event. A repo crew arrived at her downtown condo complex at 3 o'clock in the morning. Flashing amber lights illuminated the snowy street as they hooked the luxury sport utility vehicle to a tow truck. Paige ran out into the freezing night wearing silk pajamas, sobbing and pleading with the driver. He simply handed her a carbon copy receipt and hauled the vehicle away. 2 weeks later, the property management company taped a formal eviction notice to her penthouse door. She had defaulted on the rent the moment Paul's bank accounts froze. The wealthy socialites and fair-weather friends Paige had cultivated during her brief era of prosperity vanished without a trace. People like Derek Harrison operate strictly on social currency, and the Roberts family name was now synonymous with felony fraud. Finding herself homeless and penniless, Paige had no choice but to pack her designer bags and move into the cramped industrial rental with our parents. The sheer necessity of survival forced her hand. Stripped of her stolen wealth and abandoned by her elite circle, Paige secured a minimum wage position at a sprawling retail warehouse on the edge of town. I drove past that big box store a few days ago on my way to purchase feed for the dairy farm. Through the large glass sliding doors, I saw my sister. She stood near the exit wearing a bright yellow safety vest over a faded hooded sweatshirt. She held a plastic scanner checking the crumpled receipts of departing customers as they pushed heavy shopping carts toward the parking lot. Her shoulders drooped under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The arrogant spark that used to dance in her eyes was extinguished. In its place remained the dull, hollow stare of someone working a grueling 8-hour shift just to afford basic groceries. I parked my truck near the edge of the lot and watched her for a long moment. I felt no urge to gloat. Watching her scan barcodes did not bring me a rush of vindictive joy. It simply felt like a cold, unavoidable equation balancing itself out. The universe demands equilibrium. When you steal resources to build a fragile, towering illusion, gravity eventually reclaims the materials. My parents faced a similar grueling reality. Paul secured employment managing the inventory bay of a local auto parts supplier. The man who used to wear Italian leather loafers and brag about his visionary real estate acumen now spent his days wearing a stiff polyester uniform shirt. He counted spark plugs, organized cardboard shipments, and swept the concrete floors of the warehouse. A significant portion of his weekly paycheck was automatically garnished by the state to fulfill the court-ordered restitution. He would spend the rest of his working life paying off a debt for a lifestyle he only enjoyed for 4 months. Karen found work answering phones at a discount dental clinic. Her diamond pendants and silk blouses were auctioned off to satisfy the civil judgments. She dealt with rude patients and filed paperwork, swallowing her pride every single hour of the workday. She spent her evenings sitting on a thrift store sofa in their drafty apartment, listening to the rumble of semi-trucks shifting gears on the nearby highway. They were effectively neutralized. The toxic pride that had fueled their psychological abuse toward me was stripped away, leaving behind a profound, quiet isolation. They no longer attended community gatherings. They avoided eye contact with former neighbors in the grocery store aisles. The grand illusion they sacrificed their morality to build had collapsed, leaving them trapped in the stark, unforgiving reality of their own choices. I shifted my truck into drive and pulled out of the retail parking lot, leaving Paige and her barcode scanner behind in the rearview mirror. I did not visit them in their cramped rental. I did not call to offer financial assistance or hollow words of comfort. The boundary I established on that rainy Wednesday night remained firmly in place, impenetrable and permanent. They had made their decisions, and I had a legacy to rebuild. The inheritance game was officially over. The final question was no longer about surviving their greed, but about what I would create from the ashes they left behind. The ink drying on the trust transfer documents in Kenneth Bradley's office marked the official end of the legal war. I did not celebrate with expensive champagne or a lavish dinner at a downtown restaurant. I drove straight from Milwaukee back to the dairy farm, my sedan tires humming a steady rhythm along the rural highway. The leather-bound binder containing the deeds and agricultural patents sat on the passenger seat beside me. My name was now etched into the official titles of 500 acres of prime Wisconsin soil. The transition felt strangely serene, devoid of the frantic, grasping energy that had consumed my family. I parked near the rusted tractor, killed the engine, and stepped out into the damp spring air. The earth beneath my boots was soft, yielding, and rich. This was my empire. It was not built on forged signatures or predatory commercial loans. It was built on generations of honest sweat, and now it was mine to shepherd. The liquid assets within the trust provided substantial capital, but I felt zero desire to browse high-end real estate listings or visit imported car dealerships. My parents had treated wealth as a costume meant to impress strangers who did not care about them. I understood wealth as a tool meant to cultivate growth. I poured the resources directly back into the soil and the steel of the operation. I spent the long summer months overseeing a sweeping revitalization of the property. I hired local contractors to reinforce the aging timber of the main barn, replacing the rotting support beams with sturdy, locally milled oak. We did not install imported Italian marble. We laid down slip-resistant, comfortable rubber matting for the herd. Utilizing the specific agricultural patents Lucille had secured, I upgraded the milking parlor into a highly advanced ethical facility. Automated robotic milking stations replaced the outdated metal stanchions, allowing the cows to set their own schedules and drastically reducing their daily stress levels. My years working grueling overnight shifts at the emergency veterinary clinic informed every operational decision I made. I understood animal welfare on a deep clinical level. I retrofitted the holding pens with state-of-the-art climate-controlled ventilation systems to combat the sweltering humidity of late July. I brought in specialized bovine nutritionists to formulate custom feed blends, ensuring the descendants of Bessie received optimal care. The farm transitioned from a dormant parcel of land into a thriving humming engine of modern agriculture. The air vibrated with the low, steady thrum of new machinery and the contented sounds of a healthy herd. Local farmhands people who had known my grandmother and respected her tireless work ethic returned to manage the pastures. The property breathed again, infused with purpose and vibrant vitality. Revitalizing the dairy operation secured the physical land, but I needed to secure Lucille's spirit. I remembered the endless anxiety of my early 20s juggling 12-hour clinic shifts while struggling to pay for my veterinary technician certification. I recalled the bitter sting of watching my family incinerate $800,000 on fleeting luxuries while I sat in my apartment calculating the cost of basic groceries. I wanted to transmute that ugly history into something enduring and bright. Sitting at Lucille's old oak desk in the farmhouse study, surrounded by her leather-bound ledgers, I drafted the foundational documents for a new educational endowment. I coordinated with the dean of a prominent state university to establish the Lucille Roberts Memorial Scholarship. The fund was designed specifically to support working-class students pursuing demanding degrees in veterinary medicine and agricultural science. We launched the program in late August. I reviewed the applications myself, reading essays from young men and women who shared my exhausted, calloused reality. When I met the first recipient, a bright, tired girl who had been working 2 jobs to afford her anatomy textbooks, I handed her the official award letter. Watching the tears of sheer relief stream down her cheeks washed away the residual bitterness of my own past. My parents had stolen a fortune to fund a hollow illusion of status. I had turned the ashes of their theft into a multi-million-dollar community asset. The money was no longer a curse or a psychological weapon. It was a ladder offering a solid way up for those willing to climb through honest effort. I was breaking the generational cycle of toxicity, replacing their shallow greed with genuine, measurable value. The true measure of this journey crystallized on a crisp morning in late October. The Wisconsin autumn had arrived in full force, painting the oak and maple trees, lining the county road in brilliant shades of burnt orange crimson and pale gold. I woke up long before the sun, the farmhouse quiet and settled around me. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, the rich, bitter aroma filling the renovated kitchen. I walked down the hallway to the mudroom and slid my feet into Lucille's old scuffed leather boots. They were worn down at the heels, permanently molded to the shape of her steady stride, but they fit my feet perfectly. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out onto the sprawling wooden porch. The morning air was sharp, carrying a biting chill that woke my senses. A delicate layer of silver frost coated the wooden railings and the sprawling expanse of the front pasture. I inhaled deeply. The northern breeze carried the unmistakable grounding scent of white pine needles, damp fallen leaves, and fresh, fertile soil. It was the scent of endurance and survival. I wrapped both hands around my thick ceramic mug, letting the soothing heat seep into my chilled palms. I leaned my shoulder against the porch pillar and watched the eastern horizon. A ribbon of pale pink and deep indigo began to fracture the dark sky, signaling the imminent sunrise. The morning light spilled over the distant tree line, illuminating the silver grain silos and the pristine red siding of the newly renovated barn. For 4 long months, silence had been my heavy armor. I had carried it like an agonizing shield to survive the psychological warfare of a family that viewed me only as prey. That oppressive, suffocating quiet used to ring in my ears, a constant reminder of the betrayal I was hiding and the dangerous trap I was setting. As the golden sunlight crested the rolling hills and bathed the farm in its gentle warmth, I realized the heavy silence was gone. The quiet surrounding me now felt fundamentally different. It was not a trauma response. It was not a tactical maneuver designed to outwit thieves. It was a profound, unshakable peace. The frantic, grasping noise of my parents and their endless demands had been banished from my world. I had drawn an impenetrable boundary and had held firm against the fiercest storm they could conjure. I took a slow sip of my coffee, tasting the dark, earthy brew. I looked out over the acres of frost-kissed grass, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of the earth beneath the floorboards. I did not just inherit a piece of prime real estate or a corporate trust fund. I inherited the strength to walk away from poison. I have my boundaries. I have my legacy. And looking out at the dawn breaking over the Wisconsin plains, I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally found myself.